What did Ham do to Noah while he was passed out in his tent? And why was it so bad that Noah cursed Ham's son with perpetual enslavement? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and I'm talking about Genesis 9. Here's the text of verses 18 through 27, and this is really where we find our story. There's some oddities in this story. I want to read it, identify some of those oddities, and then talk about some of the ways that people have tried to resolve them, and then go on to explain what seems to me to be the best explanation for what's going on here. First, we're going to start in verse 18. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. Lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." Okay, let's talk about some oddities here. First, before we get to the curse, we are reminded twice that Canaan was the son of Ham. Now, this is peculiar because the author is really foreshadowing something that's going to happen. You need to know that Canaan is the son of Ham for this story to make any sense. But when we look at Genesis 10, Canaan is the youngest son of the four sons of Ham. So Canaan, if he's even born yet, and it's not clear that he has been born yet when this narrative is being told, is the youngest. There are three other older sons. So that's a peculiarity. Another thing to note is that Noah seems to know what happened as soon as he woke up with nobody around. And so whatever happened, did it leave evidence? Or did somebody tell Noah? The text seems to suggest he figured it out on his own, but it's not clear that whatever was done would have left evidence and also allowed Noah to identify the perpetrator. So most likely what we have here is something going on literarily. In other words, they're telling a story in a way where you're not supposed to worry about some of these details. Well, how did Noah know? He just did. Don't worry about it. And that is one of the many indicators that this is all a literary creation. This is all fictional. But then we get to perhaps one of the weirder parts of the story. Noah says he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Now, in order to see why this is weird, you have to know that in the Hebrew Bible, when you list one's children, you list them oldest to youngest. That is the convention. That is what is pretty much always followed. Ham is not the youngest son of Noah. Japheth is the youngest son of Noah. Here's the text again. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So why would he refer to Ham as his youngest son? And then, why would he curse Ham's son instead of Ham? Canaan is the youngest son of Ham, but Canaan is not the youngest son of Noah. Also, it says, lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. But then the text curses Canaan to be a slave to his uncles, not his brothers. So there is a textual way to resolve at least this peculiarity in the text. Ham likely was not a part of the story originally. Canaan likely was the youngest son of Noah. The children get shuffled at some point. So if we understand Noah's children to be Shem, Japheth, and then Canaan, not only does it make sense that Canaan is the youngest son, it makes sense that Canaan is cursed to be a servant to his brothers, Shem and Japheth. It clears all of that up. Now, that leaves the question of what exactly happened in the tent. Now, the biggest clue for a lot of people is that it says he saw his father's nakedness. Now, In the Hebrew Bible, you have a couple of different phrases associated with nakedness. You have uncover one's nakedness, and you have see one's nakedness. And the fact that these are frequently associated with illicit sexual acts, in fact, Leviticus frequently condemns uncovering the nakedness of this or that person that you shouldn't be having sex with, leads a lot of people to conclude that there's some kind of sexual indiscretion going on here. And in an era when sexual sin is represented as the dirtiest and the worst of all sin, that makes much more sense as a conclusion. So maybe it has something to do with sexual sin. So you have a few different variations on what likely happened. You have an old theory that Ham castrated Noah, and that's what would leave evidence, and somehow that is what would allow Noah to figure out who did this. You have the notion that it was paternal sexual assault, rape, that Ham raped his father. And then there's another theory that has become very popular over the last 20 years because of this 2005 Journal of Biblical Literature article by Bergsma and Hahn, that it was maternal rape, that Ham raped Noah's wife. Now, these don't make incredibly good sense of the narrative itself, because it makes it sound very, very metaphorical, because the only thing that points in the direction of one of these illicit sexual acts is just the phrase, see his nakedness, because the narrative itself doesn't suggest that, because his other sons, they back in to cover up his nakedness, to resolve whatever was the problem. And is this a metaphor for them reversing the rape of their father, of them not raping their father? Like, it doesn't make sense as a narrative unless the problem was just seeing his father naked, and then his other sons were like, oop, we're going to back in, we're going to cover up our father's nakedness without looking at our father's nakedness. And here's where I disagree with what seems to me to be the majority reading, that this has something to do with a sexual sin. I don't think it does. And the reason I don't think it does is that seeing nakedness most commonly in the Hebrew Bible has to do with being exposed to someone or something's vulnerability or their shame. The only time that I can find where seeing someone's nakedness directly has to do with illicit sexual activity is this text, Leviticus 20, verse 17. If a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father or a daughter of his mother, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace, and they shall be cut off in the sight of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, he shall be subject to punishment. So we have both the seeing of the nakedness and the uncovering of the nakedness that seem here to indicate an illicit sexual act. But in my opinion, these terms don't refer inescapably to a sexual act. It seems to me to be kind of metonymic. Seeing the nakedness and uncovering the nakedness is one step in a number of steps that results in an illicit sexual act. So we're just referring kind of euphemistically to one of the early steps. So it doesn't necessarily refer inescapably to the sexual act. And one of the reasons I think this is so is because elsewhere we find both of those terms used in reference to exposure to vulnerability and shame. So for instance, in this passage, Genesis 42, verse 9, and then also verse 12, Joseph also remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them. So this is Joseph in Egypt. His brothers still don't know what's going on. He's still playing the bad cop. He said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." But he said to them, "No, you have come to see the nakedness of the land." The idea here is that they have come to spy out the vulnerability of the land on behalf of their own nation. We also have in Isaiah 47:3, "Your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one." And this is the use of nakedness as a symbol of shame. And the same thing is true of Lamentations 1:8. Jerusalem sinned grievously, so she has become a filthy thing. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. This is about shame. And then we have the two phrases brought together again in Ezekiel 16:37. "Therefore, I will gather all your lovers with whom you took pleasure, all those you loved and all those you hated. I will gather them against you from all around and will uncover your nakedness to them so that they may see all your nakedness. So here the ideas are quite literal. We're uncovering your naked body. They're going to see your naked body, and this is about shame. And so I think that's what's going on here. The uncovering the nakedness can be used euphemistically, metonymically, to refer to illicit sexual activity, but it is also, and more commonly, used to refer to the exposure of vulnerability and shame. So what does it mean that Ham saw his father's nakedness? It means he saw his father passed out drunk and naked. And that is exposure to your father's shame. You're supposed to protect your father's honor. So what was Ham's sin? He failed to protect his father's honor and then went out and giggled and said, "Guess what I just saw?" And then it is his brothers who go in and, without looking at his shame, cover it up to protect his honor. So I think the most likely reading is that what's going on here is just that Ham saw his father's nakedness and failed to protect his father's honor. Now that doesn't sound to us like something that merits so severe a punishment. But in a world that is built on honor and shame, it is phenomenally important. So I think just seeing your father naked and not protecting his honor is a sin, a transgression worthy of a very, very severe punishment. But that brings us to the punishment. Why is it Canaan and not Ham? Well, again, in the earliest version of this story, it probably was Canaan who did it as the youngest son of Noah. But we're stitching this story into Genesis 10, where Shem, Ham, and Japheth have to be the eponymous ancestors of the three different main people groups around the world. Canaan is not one of them. And so we're taking him out of that family. We're moving him into another part of the family. So I think you've got a little textual alteration going on here as this story is being worked into an already existing narrative. But then the punishment is about why Canaan is going to be subservient and slave to his two uncles, namely Shem and Japheth. And this is an etiology for the notion that the Canaanites are unworthy people. They need to be subjugated. They're worthy of genocide, according to some of the later texts. And this is probably the rhetorical, ideological goal of the framing of the story in the way it has come down to us. So I think we have some textual changes going on here that are responsible for some of the things that are a little confusing to us, that don't seem to fit. The cultural distance and the values of a culture built on honor and shame, I think, are responsible for the fact that the curse seems a little incongruous, disproportionate to the actual transgression, the actual sin that was committed. I think that accounts for that. Now, these other theories that are brought up overwhelmingly are trying to protect the integrity and the unity of the story. Now, I don't mind saying, hey, this is probably a composite text or an amended text. This is something that has been textually fiddled with. Critical scholars generally don't mind doing that. It's not the first thing that we jump to, but it is something that is not off the table. Most of these other theories that reduce this to some kind of sexual sin are trying to preserve and protect that unity. They want to make sense of why the curse would be Canaan. Oh, well, maybe Ham raped Noah's wife, and the result, the offspring, was Canaan, and that's why Noah is cursing Canaan. So all of this is a way to make sense of it by using the act as the variable, and by keeping off the table the textual instability of the story. We're not going to go to that. That is outside of the question. We're going to use that variable of the act to try to resolve all of the incongruities, the inconsistencies, the confusing parts. So I think that's why the sexual sin theories have become so popular. Additionally, it's a lot more salacious for a society that does not think of exposure to a parent's nudity as so grievous a sin. Something sexual is just what the doctor ordered. That's going to be something that is going to make the story a lot more interesting to people today. That's going to make the punishment seem to fit the crime a lot better. But in the end, I think the narrative pretty clearly explains what happened. the son simply saw the father naked, and rather than protect the father's honor, went out and spread news about this. And so the other two sons had to come in and protect the father's honor, and that was considered a heinous transgression. And it resulted in the cursing of Canaan, but this was really all an etiology for why the Canaanites are unworthy people and why they should be subjugated to all the nations around them. And I think that's what's going on in the story of Genesis 9. And I think acknowledging textual instability and being willing to recognize a composite, or at least an amended text, resolves all of the issues a lot more easily and a lot more parsimoniously than trying to insist that some kind of grievous sexual sin was being smuggled in here with this metaphorical story about a dad being naked and other sons having to cover him up. And the fit for this video is the Chili Peppers.